Greetings and welcome everyone to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. I want to thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, for those of you that have not heard my show before, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity the way it really would have happened. And on today's show, we are going to continue our discussion with what I am referring to as, I'm titling this, the house and lineage of David. Now, the house and lineage of David is a phrase that we get from the Gospel of Luke, the genealogy in the Gospel of Luke, and that's what we're looking at today. That's what we're talking about today, is the genealogies of Jesus Christ. I've been promising to get to this for a couple of weeks, and you know what? We might even get there today. We'll see. I've got a little bit of extra information that I want to talk about today that's really exciting, but we are headed towards these genealogies in Matthew and in Luke. In Matthew, it's in Matthew chapter 1. In Luke, it is in Luke chapter 3, and they are the genealogies concerning Jesus of Nazareth. And these things are important. And as I've said, I've been baiting you guys for a couple of weeks now, saying that these are much more than simply a list of names. That is not the only thing that is going on here. I shared a couple of weeks ago, I gave you an example of how you can start reading the Bible, and you can read Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 6 and 7 and 8 and never lose interest. But I skipped right over Genesis chapter 5, and that's because Genesis chapter 5 is a genealogy. And most of the time, a genealogy in a Bible or in a story, in a history of some type, is really unremarkable, except in its ability to make you want to skip to whatever is next. Okay. And I get that if you're, like I said, if you're reading Genesis 1, that's the creation. That's exciting. Genesis 2 is the Garden of Eden. That's exciting. Genesis 3 is the temptation and fall of mankind. That's exciting. Genesis 4 is the first, it's Cain and Abel. It's the first murder in the Bible. Genesis 6 is Noah and the giants and the Nephilim and the flood. And then Genesis 7, 8, and 9 is the flood, and 10 is Nimrod, and 11 is at least partially a genealogy again, and then 12 is Abraham. But we skip right over these genealogies, and it's really a crying shame that we do, because genealogies are gold mines of cryptic information. And I'm reminded of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, where he said that not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law until all things be fulfilled. And a jot or a yod, or a tittle, they are a part of a letter in Hebrew. It's like the dotting of an I or the crossing of a T. It is a part of a letter, right? And he is implying by that statement that even parts of letters carry information. As a matter of fact, I'm reminded of the fact that there is an old Jewish saying that says, when the Messiah comes, not only will he finally bring us the truest interpretation of the Tanakh and the Torah, this is a Jewish saying, right? That not only will the Messiah provide the ultimate interpretation of the Tanakh and the Torah, but he will interpret every word. He will interpret every letter. And as a matter of fact, he will interpret the spaces between the letters, right? So it actually makes a whole lot of sense if you know anything about Hebraic hermeneutics, about Jewish hermeneutics, and the different levels that they anticipate finding in every scripture. In every scripture, they believe that every scripture not only has a plain meaning, but has a symbolic meaning, has a, what's the word I want to use? An interpretive meaning, symbolic interpretive, but then also a cryptic meaning, a hidden meaning. And genealogies are gold mines of cryptic information, and hopefully we're going to actually get to a little bit of these genealogies today. But there is something else I want to talk about, and it's interrelated. It's absolutely interrelated, so I don't feel bad about kind of taking you on a little bit of a rabbit trail and then coming back. And because what I want to do is I want to remind you once again about how I got the label God Save the King, right? Many of you, if you're familiar with my show, if you've listened to me before, you've heard the story before, okay? It was back in the mid 1980s. My older brother, Dan, who has now passed away, and my website is kind of dedicated to him in a manner of speaking. My older brother, Dan, was a workman of the word and a Bible scholar and a playwright. And he had actually been commissioned to write a series of dramatic productions about the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, okay? And the problem that he was encountering was, how do I tell this story? Because everybody already knows it. Well, what he's referring to, obviously, with the everybody already knows it, is he's referring to the traditional nativity story, what we would sometimes call the Christmas story, air quotes, right? The Christmas story. And that's actually not accurate. And right about this same time, both he and I were introduced to the hypothesis that Jesus was not born on December 25th. And the part of the problem is at that time, we assumed that even though the date of his birth might change, that the story didn't. And we couldn't have been more wrong. What I have discovered over 30 years of research is that the story changes dramatically. But at any rate, what he was faced with at the time was, how do I tell the story in an interesting way? Because this is a story that everybody thinks they know because of the traditional nativity story. And the idea he came up with was to tell the story through the eyes of different characters in the biblical narrative, to tell the story through the eyes of the shepherds, or to tell the story through the eyes of the magi, the wise men, or frankly, to tell the story through the eyes of Herod the Great, the Roman appointed client king of Judea. And as a working title for telling it through the eyes of Herod the Great, he came up with the pun, God Save the King. Because Herod was, like I said, he was a Roman appointee, right? He was not a legitimate king. He was not a Judean king. He wasn't of the right tribe. He wasn't of the right house. He didn't have a drop of Judean blood. And when the Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great, they say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" In other words, they're making a declaration and frankly an accusation right to Herod's face, saying, well, you're not the legitimate king. Where is the legitimate king, right? So my brother Dan very cleverly came up with this pun to call the play God Save the King, because we also know that Herod, when he was challenged by the Magi, that he asked them to report back to him about this young child, that when they found him, he wanted them to send the intelligence back to him so that he could send out his black ops team and remove this threat to his throne. So when we say God Save the King, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Jesus of Nazareth, or are we talking about Herod the Great, right? And what we didn't realize at the time was just how prescient and prophetic this title is, because what my brother Dan did is he immediately began working on these plays. What I did is I turned them into Bible teachings, right? And I have been teaching this through all around the United States and all around the world now for 30 years, 35 years that I've been teaching this. And I've called it God Save the King ever since, borrowing that title from my brother. And we had no idea just how prescient and prophetic this title is. So I want to tell you a few things about that help you understand why this title is so interesting, right? It is really proven to be very, very interesting. So part of it is what I just said, right? The Magi, the wise men from the east, when they show up at the court of Herod the Great, they declare and they challenge him and they say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" Now, this is very provocative because of who the Magi are. So, once again, we sometimes fall victim to the traditional nativity story, and we don't delve deeply into the historical background of who these men were, so that we understand this threat, frankly, that we would understand this threat. Why would they be showing up at the court of Herod the Great and saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews?" Well, you have to understand who the Magi were. Who were they and what was their job description? And in their realm, in their empire, in the Parthian Empire, who the Magi were is they were the elite scholars and religious slash political officials of their realm. They played several different roles that all overlapped. Like I said, they were scholars, they were religious officials, they were political officials, and they served all of these functions in what was known as the House of Magistanes, which is where we get the word magistrate. Okay, later on, we get the word magistrate. This was the House of Magistanes. And included in their responsibilities was giving a daily intelligence briefing to the king. Okay, and that intelligence briefing included reading the stars, and then they would interpret the stars, interpret the omens, and then pass this information on to the king. They also interpreted dreams. Okay, so if a magi had a dream, or frankly, if the king had a dream, right? And we see this, in the book of Daniel, that when the king has a dream, the magi are there as the interpreters of that dream, because it's very important that we know and understand a dream that came to the king of the realm. See? And that's put on display for us in the book of Daniel. And it's very provocative that, Daniel was named Rabmag, okay, which means head or chief of the Magi, by Nebuchadnezzar, right? So, and that's right about the time, 600 BC-ish, right around there, is when the wise men began to be known by the label Magian or Magi. Okay, now that type of religious political official who was also a celestial observer, they had been around, they had been in ancient Mesopotamia for at least 2,000 to 3,000 years at that point. But it's only at about 600 BC is when they started being labeled magi, because when they show up at the court of Herod, and then Matthew tells us the story, he says, "Behold, wise men from the east," in the Greek magoi. When these wise men from the east showed up, he assumes we know who they are. He doesn't give us any introductory information and tell us about who these guys are. There is a certain degree of assumption that we know who these men are. And so in their job description, in their empire, they delivered a daily intelligence briefing to the king. This included reading the stars and dream interpretation. And it included, here you go, it included oversight of the royal genealogies. That is something they did. They oversaw the royal genealogies, because when the king of the realm died, it was actually up to the House of Magistanes to determine who the next king would be. The Parthian Empire actually had a very interesting process, okay, that was unlike, it was similar to, but yet unlike other kingdoms in that region, which is that they did not automatically practice the right of primogeniture. Now, the right of primogeniture would mean that when the king died, his eldest son would become king. Okay, so that was the assumption in many empires of that day and time, was that the the king's son, eldest son, would immediately become king. The Parthians did not necessarily do that. It was occasionally assumed, but at the same time, it fell to the house of Magistanes, the Magi, who oversaw the royal genealogies and read the stars and interpreted dreams, that they would determine who the next king would be. Okay, so when they show up at the court of Herod the Great, these men were not the mystery that we think they were, right? I mean, to us, they're mysterious because that's the only mention we get, right? Matthew says, behold, wise men from the east came to the court of Herod the Great saying, where is he who was born king of the Jews? And that's all we're told. We're not told who they are or what they do or exactly where they came from or how they did their job, right? That requires historical investigation to discover their job description, as I've said. So now that we know their job description, this takes on a whole new flavor. That they have shown up at the court of Herod the Great and not very subtly said, where is the legitimate king? Because you're not him. You're not him. And we have to remember that Mesopotamian and Jewish history have been very closely intertwined for the past 600 years at this point. Ever since the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, followed by the Persian conquest of Babylon, and then the Greek conquest of Persia, right? There is now a large Jewish community in Mesopotamia, specifically in the region of Babylonia, okay, and in the city of Babylon. There is a large Jewish community there, okay? So there is cross-pollination, for lack of a better term, going on between the Jewish community and the Babylonian community, right? That the Jews are learning from the Babylonians are learning from the Jews. Yes, the Jews did try to keep themselves separate to a certain degree, but at the same time, that's how the systems of the world work, right? That, Babylonian Jews started to absorb knowledge from the Babylonians. And then when the Greeks moved in, the Persians first, and then the Greeks came in, you had Jews getting very strong Hellenic influence, right? And because of Alexander's empire, because of the Hellenism promoted by his empire, there is a whole family of quote unquote Jewish royalty that is predominantly known by their Greek names. We don't really know them by their Hebrew names. Okay, we know them by their Greek names, and that was because the Hasmoneans were highly Hellenized, right? Some more than others, okay? And that is a big part of what sets the stage for why God Save the King really is this story about royal succession. And that's the point I want to drive at today in leading up to talking about these genealogies, is this really is the focal point of God Save the King. God Save the King is all about royal succession. Who is the legitimate king, and that we should be declaring God Save the King, the legitimate king, not looking for the pretender, looking for the real king, right? So this there it is again, ladies and gentlemen, the God Save the King. It is the contrast between Herod the Great and Jesus of Nazareth, but it is so much more than that, because you had this whole Hasmonean dynasty, okay, that threw off Seleucid rule in the mid-2nd century BC, and they became this de facto royal family in this independent kingdom of Judea. Now, this is very provocative. All by itself, this is very provocative, because we are told that the progenitor of the house of Hasmon, right, Mattathias, right, that he was a priest. We're not told that he was from the tribe of Judah. We are not told that he is from the house of David. And to the best of my knowledge, they were never able to establish that. They were never able to demonstrate that they were from the tribe of Judah or the house of David. They were priests. Okay. And it was prescribed in the Old Testament that the hereditary priesthood and the hereditary monarchy should be distinct. The priesthood came from the tribe of Levi and the house of Aaron, and then the hereditary monarchy came from the tribe of Judah and the house of David, and they were not supposed to overlap. So when this de facto royal family comes to power in the middle of the 2nd century BC, now you have Jews that you've got the Jews divided, right? So you've got the more, for lack of a better word, you've got the more cosmopolitan Jews, okay, the more Hellenized Jews. They've got a little easier time of dealing with it, right? Of that, okay, well, they're not of the house, they're not of the tribe of Judah, they're not of the house of David, but okay, at least they're a king, at least they're Jewish, at least we're not under foreign dominion anymore. And yet at the same time, they themselves are becoming more and more Hellenized. And then you also have the intermixing with the various religious factions within the kingdom of Judah, right? You've got the more, for lack of a better word, liberal Sadducees, the more Hellenized and liberal Sadducees, and then the more strictly devout Judaic, Hebraic, and conservative Pharisees, right? And so as you go through this line of Hasmonean kings, some of them favored the Pharisees, some favored the Sadducees, some were favored by the Pharisees, others were favored by the Sadducees, okay? And it was all very highly politicized, and they frequently engaged in activities that were frankly not very king-like, right? And violated Torah and things like that. And then when you get to, when our story, the rubber really starts to hit the road, is in the middle of the 1st century BC, when you get this civil war between these two brothers, right? The Hasmonean dynasty has gone through several generations, right? And then King Alexander Jannaeus dies. His wife, Alexandra Salome, becomes queen, and then she, acts as regent for her young son, Hyrcanus, because he is not old enough to be king yet. So she rules, right? But then she dies, and now you've got these two Judean / Hasmonean princes. And I say Judean not because they're from the tribe of Judah, but because they're from the kingdom of Judea, right? You've got these two brothers, these two princes, who each believe they should be king of Judea. And even that label king is really, what's the word I want to use here? It's not an exact term, right? Dubious. That's the word I wanted. It's really dubious because they're not from the royal family, right? They can't call themselves king if they're not from the royal family. They can only call themselves high priest, right? But nonetheless, certain members of the Hasmonean dynasty nonetheless started to call themselves king, right? And so in 67 BC, when Alexandra Salome dies and Hyrcanus and Aristobulus engage in this civil war for the throne, now you have this issue of royal succession, right? So in the background, you've got the legitimate house of David, right? Because under the Hasmoneans, right? Now remember, they call it the kingdom of Judea. They call it the kingdom of Judea because when Judea gained its independence from the Seleucid Empire, it was this little tiny dot of a kingdom around Jerusalem. It wasn't very big at all, okay? But the Hasmoneans, nonetheless, even though they weren't from the right tribe, even though they weren't from the right house, they nonetheless took upon themselves the posturing of being Judean royalty, because they could say, well, it's the kingdom of Judea, right? So they started to act like Judean royalty. They started to act like kings of old, right? And one of the things that David and Solomon were known for was how much they expanded the kingdom, because the land grant that was cited to Abraham all the way back in Genesis was Abraham was told that the nation of Israel, the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham, went all the way from the river of Egypt all the way to the great river, the river Euphrates. Okay, let me repeat that. All the way from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Okay, that is not the modern borders of Israel, right? Now, there is some debate as to what the river of Egypt means. Now, the Nile should immediately spring to mind. That's what you should be thinking, but there is some debate in scholastic circles about whether that is the river that is being pictured here, or whether there's another river that is between kind of like the modern border of Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. There's another river, the name escapes me, that is in that general area, and that may be the river that is being referred to. But the great river Euphrates, there's no question about that. Now, what portion of the Euphrates are they referring to? That's a little bit unclear, because the Euphrates runs at a diagonal from northwest to southeast. Okay, so when you're in the northern segment of the Euphrates River, well, that's the closest to Israel as you kind of wrap around the Mediterranean coast and move north. That's where the closest crossing of the Euphrates would be. But then if you were to go due east from like Jerusalem, right, you've actually got to go hundreds of miles before you're going to run into the Euphrates, because it runs at this angle. But at any rate, David and Solomon expanded the kingdom, right? It was at its largest geographically under David and Solomon. And now this is 1,000 years later. I mean, David and Solomon, that's roughly 1,900 BC. Now you're upwards of 850 years later or more, depending on what you use as your starting point. You're in the middle of the 2nd century to the middle of the 1st century BC with the Hasmonean dynasty, and they are at least trying to act like the Jewish kings of old. So some of them were very aggressive in expanding their territory, right? So they annexed Galilee, they annexed Idumea, right? That's a big deal, right? Because they forcibly required the Idumeans to convert to Judaism, which, Judaism, that's not a prescription of Old Testament law, that you force a conquered people to adopt your religion. That's not in the Torah. Okay, that's not how this works. That is not how the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob works. He's a God of free will. He's a God that gives you the choice and wants you to follow him because you choose to, right? So it's very outside the realm of following Torah, yet nonetheless, some of the Hasmonean kings did that. They expanded the territory. And so you've got this really interesting equation of, once again, not the right tribe, not the right house, yet they're calling themselves royalty, yet they're not calling themselves royalty. And now you have an issue of royal succession, because you've got a civil war between these two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, and that gets fired up in about 67 BC, right? And then a few years later, it comes to the attention of Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, the Roman general, because Pompey had been called out of retirement by the Roman Senate, okay? in 67 BC, right, to deal with the problem of quote unquote pirates in the Mediterranean. What is meant by pirates is that there were maritime pirates, okay, but maritime shenanigans, pirates, warfare, thievery, things like that, that impeded trade, sea trade, right? And Rome, the Roman Republic at that time, relied heavily on sea trade, and these quote unquote pirates were, um, creating a problem. Well, Pompey handled that problem very quickly. He was commissioned, his commission was supposed to last like 3 years to deal with these pirates, and he did it in like 3 months, right? And as a result, because of the fact that he was so successful, the Roman Senate asked him to take care of another problem, which was there was this continuing war with a region of Asia Minor called Pontus. Okay, so Pompey went to war with Mithridates of Pontus, right? And he won that war pretty handily, and then he moved into Armenia. Okay, and as a result of winning these wars, Pontus became a Roman province. What's the other one? There's another. It's escaping me at the moment. It'll come to me. There's another chunk of Asia Minor that became a Roman province, right? Okay. Roman Syria became a province, right? Armenia became a client kingdom. And by the way, Pompey was like, oh, well, who's next? Well, I need to control as much of the Mediterranean coastline as possible to keep free trade moving as much as possible. I guess I'll just move down the coast. So that means that Judea was next on his list. And of course, the fact that there's these two feuding brothers and this civil war going on, that comes to his attention. And Pompey intervenes. And I'm really, really, really oversimplifying this so I can get to the point here, is that he chooses, there's a bidding war. Both the brothers try to bribe him, and then he winds up choosing Hyrcanus. Okay, but as a result, here Aristobulus, the other brother, he's really upset by that, and he takes off. And this is vastly oversimplified, because at first he gets taken captive by Pompey. Pompey takes him and two of his sons captive back to Rome. Okay, and he doesn't manage to get turned loose for a number of years. But after he gets turned loose, he runs off to the Parthians, okay, to try to get them to help him, right? Now, what's really interesting is, here's what I'm driving at, is that you've got these are the pieces of the puzzle. And someone joked about this back when we were making the television show several years ago. I forget who came up with it, but someone said, man, this sounds like Game of Thrones. And absolutely. And I mean, I've been aware of this for decades, that I've been doing this research, that this really is Game of Thrones on steroids. And it's because this is real. This is real historical stuff, right? Because not only do you have the legitimate Davidic bloodline in the background, right? And like I said, you've got the Hasmonean kingdom has declared its independence from the Seleucid Empire, and they annexed this territory, right? Well, one of the earlier segments of Israel to get annexed was Galilee, right? Now, Galilee had been largely depopulated because of the Assyrian captivity. And then when it started to get repopulated, it had a real Hellenic flavor to it. So the Hasmoneans wanted to restore the Judaic flavor to Galilee. So they encouraged Judeans, as in like Judeans, like House of Judah Judeans, to transplant themselves from the southern part of the kingdom around to Jerusalem and to move to the north and to repopulate Galilee. Now, this is widely unknown, that Galilee became a hotbed of Judean patriotism. Okay, let me repeat that. This is important. Galilee became a hotbed of Jewish conservatism and patriotism. All right. When Herod came to power initially, he was only like 25 or 26 years old when he got appointed to be the governor of Galilee by his father Antipater, who was the chief minister for Hyrcanus, right? One of his first responsibilities was to put down the rebels, quote unquote, here's the air quotes for those of you that can't see me on screen, was to put down the rebels that were running rampant through Galilee. Well, rebel is a relative term because who and who is not a rebel depends upon where your allegiance lies. I mean, all you have to do is look at, the American Revolution, or to use a totally off the wall, illustration, look at Star Wars, right? Okay, who's the rebel and who's the patriot, right? Because if you're part, Star Wars very clearly patterned after the Roman Empire in many ways, right? If you're a follower of the empire or a friend of the empire, then anybody that is fighting against you is the rebel. Okay, they're not the patriot; they're the rebels. See, so the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, right? Ironically, they were considered rebels because they wanted to throw off the Syrian Greek Seleucids, right? Because they were Hellenizing their country. So they wanted to get rid of them. So they were called rebels. Well, now the enemy is Rome. Okay. And you've still got the Hellenizing influence because even though it's a Roman culture, a Latin culture, they also were still very heavily influenced by Hellenism. So you had Latin being spoken, you had Greek being spoken, all this stuff. And that's a heavy influence on the culture as well. So these rebels, depending upon your point of view, were they rebels or were they patriots? And if you're looking at it from a Jewish perspective, these were patriots, not rebels. Okay. And yet that was Herod's first job, was to put down these rebels in Galilee. Right. And Herod was very well known in Galilee because that was where he cut his teeth. That is where he learned how to rule. He was made the governor of Galilee first. Okay. But what else is going on in this? So you got all this stuff spinning around in the background. So you've got this legitimate Judean, right? House of David, tribe of Judah, House of David bloodline that's still there, right? They may not be making a whole lot of noise openly other than clamoring for the restoration of the Davidic house, but you don't see legitimate Davidic claimants to the throne starting wars, right? And yet at the same time, you've got these rebels, right, in Galilee who are starting trouble and saying, we want the house of David restored. So Galilee is a hotbed of Judean patriotism, right? House of David, because of this migration of members of the tribe of Judah and quote unquote the house of David from the southern part of the kingdom to the northern part of the kingdom, because the Hasmoneans wanted to re-Judaize the country. So look at everywhere we turn, this is about royal succession, whether real royal succession, right, or frankly fake royal succession, because you've got the house of David in the background, right? And that's Joseph and Mary, right? We are told in the genealogies. We will get there eventually, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe not today, probably next week, where we actually start talking about the genealogies themselves and like I keep saying, the gold mine of cryptic information. But this is the big picture. This is all about royal succession, because you've got the legitimate house of David in the background. It's in the background. It's behind the scenes. Yes, you've got Judean rebels clamoring for a new Davidic king, right? Okay. But, there's no names from the house of David. that I'm aware of all through Josephus or the Bible, right? Until we get to Joseph and Mary, right? That's when the house of David comes back into the picture, right? But you do have the house of Hasmon, right? The Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, who are pretending to be Davidic, right? They're pretending to be the royalty of the kingdom of Judah, and yet they are having squabbles over succession. And you've got one of their house running off to the Parthians, the home of the Magi, whose job it is to oversee royal succession, and saying, hey, if you'll back my claim, you'll have a pro-Parthian, anti-Roman king on the throne of Judah. Okay. And superpowers back then are just like superpowers today. They want someone on the throne who's going to represent their interests. See, so Rome wants a pro-Roman king on the throne. Parthia wants a pro-Parthia king on the throne. And oh, look at what you have brewing here. You've got a civil war between two brothers, okay, each one of which who has run off to a major superpower to enlist their allegiance. And then you've also got the Jewish population divided between them. It couldn't be a more classic scenario than contestant number one over here, contestant number two over here. This one, Hyrcanus, is allied with Rome, and he's got this part of the Jewish population allied with him, and then you've got Aristobulus, who is allied with Parthia, and then he's got, this part of the Jewish populace backing him. But here's the even more interesting part, is that you've also got royal succession issues going on in Rome, and you've got royal succession issues going on in Parthia. So God Save the King takes on a whole nother layer of information here because of what's going on. You've got these civil wars going on in the Roman Republic, which is about to become the Roman Empire. Okay. Now, the Roman Republic had prided itself on the fact that there hadn't been a Roman king for centuries. They were a representative republic, at least to a large degree. They were the Roman Republic, where the people were represented by senators in the Senate, right? But right around the turn of the 1st century, okay, that's when Roman history started to really change, and it started on this very quick acceleration to empire, meaning having an emperor, having a single leader, right? And I won't go into the background there. Where it intersects with our story is with Pompey and then Caesar, right? It goes further back than that, but that's where it intersects our story, is that Pompey was a very highly regarded Roman military leader and politician, very highly regarded. But then he goes head to head with Julius Caesar, who is also a very highly regarded military leader and politician, who is very popular with the people. And there's a tremendous backstory there because of how popular Caesar was, and the fact that the Pompeian party, right, the anti-Caesarian party, they were afraid of him, frankly, declaring himself king, right? So that is a de facto issue of royal succession, and they go to war, and Caesar defeats Pompey, and then Pompey gets murdered, and then Caesar gets assassinated by the anti-Caesarian party led by Brutus and Cassius, right? And then you've got the Caesarians in the name of Marcus Antonius, Octavian, and Lepidus going after the assassins. And it's all this issue of royal succession, right? And then in Parthia, on the other side of the Euphrates, you've got Parthian royal succession issues with King Orotus and then his sons and his brothers fighting over the throne, until you finally get King Phraates IV becomes king of Parthia, because he murders all of the other contestants for the throne, and he's the only contestant left for the Magi to pick. He's the only one left, right? And then ironically, he dies in 2 BC, right before the Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great. Now, what is up with that? Really, is that a coincidence? Is that a coincidence that the Parthian Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great, questioning him about the royal succession when that's their job and their king has just died as well? So, but there's a part of the story that I want to tell you about, that it's not necessarily some great big huge profound highly emphasized point of the story, but it's just some really interesting trivia that is interwoven into this spider web of this story and this mystery and all of this, I keep saying, this royal succession, because the world at that time, the world is spinning out of control, because you've got Roman royal succession, you've got Parthian royal succession, you've got Hasmonean royal succession, and then this is not to mention the little client kingdoms that are all over there, right? Commagene and Nabatea and all these other little nation states that are in that region, they're having royal succession issues. And you've also got the fact, by the way, that, oh yeah, by the way, the Parthian kings love to call themselves King of Kings, right? Wow, isn't that interesting? King of Kings, right? But there's this other little part of the story, and where I'm actually running out of time, but there's this other part of the story that I want to tell you about that is just really provocative, because not because it's some big, huge, important point. It's really more trivia. It's more details, right? But these details are so provocative. That's what I'm driving at here. So if you are at all familiar with classical antiquity, you've probably heard of the Greek poet Homer, okay? And the fact that he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you are also familiar with classical antiquity, you may have heard of the Roman poet Virgil, okay? So his full name was Publius Virgilius Maro, right? Known pretty much simply as Virgil, but he was an ancient Roman poet from this day and age, from the Augustan age, okay? He lived in roughly the same era as the Emperor Augustus, right? Now, he is most well known for his epic national poem called the Aeneid, right? That's what he is most known for. But he also wrote other epic poetry that is considered to be some of the most famous poetry in Latin literature. And there's two collections of poems. One is called the Georgics, right? And then the other is called the Eclogues. That's Eclogues, the Eclogues, right? And the fourth Eclogue has come to people's attention for some really interesting reasons that I'll mention in just a second. But before we do, let me also mention the fact that Virgil was very influential on Western culture, okay? Most notably from Dante's Divine Comedy, because he is a character in Dante's Divine Comedy, and it is Virgil who appears to Dante to guide him through hell and purgatory, right? Inferno and Purgatorio, right? So it is Virgil that appears to Dante as his guide through hell and purgatory, right? So for Virgil to show up in Dante's Divine Comedy, that tells you what a massive influence he was on Western culture. T.S. Eliot said that the Aeneid was a classic of all Europe, okay? So, but the Eclogues, this collection of poems called the Eclogues, was written in like 39, 38 BC. But the fourth Eclogue has attracted a lot of attention because it speaks of a golden age, there's the air quotes again, of a golden age that will be inaugurated due to the birth of a special child. Okay, well, what does that sound like, right? A golden age that will be inaugurated due to the birth of a special child, right? Now, this is in pagan Latin poetry from the Augustan age, but nonetheless, it got picked up on by early Christians who tried to turn this into a prophecy of Christ. Now that is really questionable. I mean, is it possible that there was this unknowing reference to Christ? I suppose maybe in a very bizarre, sideways, outside kind of manner, it may have been an unknowing reference to Christ, maybe, but I don't think so. I don't think that's who Virgil had in mind, right? At all. I don't think that's what Virgil had in mind. Most likely what Virgil had in mind was the offspring of his patron. Virgil had a patron that I'm going to talk about in a second, and I'm going to connect him to God Save the King, okay? Is that Virgil probably had in mind the offspring of his patron, that when this patron was going to have children, presumably a son, he was using this euphemistically as this was the special child that was going to inaugurate this golden age, right? So that's one possibility. Another possibility was that Virgil was referring to the offspring of Antony and Cleopatra. And another possibility is that he was referring to the offspring of Octavian and his wife, whose name escapes me. So I won't try to dig that up, right? But this is Virgil writing about this golden age and this special child, right? That was twisted into being a kind of Christian prophecy by some of the early Christians. And what's really interesting about this is why it's provocative, is that Virgil found his way into the quote unquote Christmas story as a result. There are Latin copies of the nativity story from the 11th century that record a list of prophets that prophesied Christ. Okay. And the list of prophets, of course, includes Moses and David and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all of the Jewish prophets of the Old Testament, but then it includes Virgil, of all people. Okay. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't believe that he was a legitimate prophet of Christ. I think they are twisting frankly, a coincidence, okay, into something that it is not. Now, it's not a coincidence in this sense that messianic expectation was common throughout the known world, that this was part of the here it is. It's part of the epic poetry of the Roman culture that there was a golden age was upon them, and that a special child was upon them. See, so the broad concept of a messianic figure and a golden age, and that frankly is just what's the word I want to use here? From later on, much later in world literature, English author, oh good grief, I can't believe it means nowhere in Latin. But it's obviously this spin-off from the millennial age that is promised in the Bible. See, humanity wants to counterfeit the millennium, right? Humanity wants to counterfeit the millennium, right? So that is what is going on here with Virgil prophesying this golden age and this special child. So it's really interesting that Virgil finds his way into the Christmas story as a prophet of Christ, and in one version of the story, he's included among the Magi. Isn't that too funny that Virgil is included among the Magi? It's ridiculous, right? But it just goes to show how twisted the nativity story became over the years, and that this is why, you hear me call the nativity story Christian mythology, is all this wacko stuff got included in it. Now, we're really running out of time, and I want to get this point in. But I mentioned Virgil's patron, okay? Because Virgil owned land in northern Italy, okay? Now, when the Caesarian party, after Caesar's assassination, when Antonius and Octavian and Lepidus defeated Cassius and Brutus in the civil war that followed Caesar's assassination. Octavian promised his veterans land in northern Italy, and he started appropriating land, shall we say, in northern Italy and handing it out to his veterans. Well, he tried to appropriate the land of Virgil, right? He tried to take his land and give it away to his veterans. And one of Caesar's trusted officials, whose name was Pollio, okay, Pollio, Gaius Asinius Pollio, he actually stepped in and prevented Octavian from giving that land away, okay, giving Virgil's land away. And as a result of this, Pollio became Virgil's patron. And the fourth eclogue, here we go, this is why I brought it up, the fourth eclogue is dedicated to Pollio. Okay, it's dedicated to him, and he is mentioned in the fourth eclogue, which isn't that really interesting, okay? But it gets even one more step really interesting here, which is that if you fast forward to about 22 BC, Herod wanted his sons to get the best education possible, but he had murdered his son's mother several years earlier, so he also needed to get them out of his hair. So he sent them off to Rome to get an education. And who were they educated with? But they were educated by Gaius Asinius Pollio, who the man who the fourth eclogue, which is filled with messianic expectation, is dedicated to. So it's just this really odd spider web of royal succession and all this weird stuff in the mix, and the fact that you've got the royal house of David in the background, you've got this Hasmonean royal succession in the foreground, confusing the heck out of everybody, and now Herod's going to become a part of it. You've got Roman royal succession, you've got Parthian royal succession, and this giant mess to which the creator of the universe is going to very quietly slip the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's going to bring him in behind the scenes very quietly in this little backwater town outside of Jerusalem called Bethlehem. Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, because he would eventually be raised in Nazareth, but he's born in Bethlehem because he is of the house and lineage of David. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. My name is Tim Keyes. You have been listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. God Save the King.